And we'll pick up our study back in that passage here in just a moment. Acts chapter 16. We started this study last week, and we're trying to travel with Paul here. Well, this is which trip? He made 3, and this is the second one, and he's going to travel with whom this time? Silas, right? He's going to pick up Silas, and how did Silas get introduced to Paul? Where did he meet him from? Jerusalem, right? Remember they had that difficulty in Antioch. They went down to Jerusalem to have the conversation, and those in Jerusalem decided they would send a group of individuals with them back up to Antioch to deliver this message about particularly circumcision and all the Judaizing issues that they had. And Silas was part of that group. And they get to Antioch and they decide that they should go back. And Paul really kind of initially, his statement was he wanted to do what in terms of this trip? Reestablish, right? He wanted to go revisit those areas. And Ed mentioned last week in our study an interesting point. He wants to go revisit areas, including an area that what? Tried to kill him, right? And had at one point tried to put him to death. So it's interesting that Paul still has confidence in the work that he's doing in the cause of Christ. So he decides that he wants to make this trip. But what happens in terms of he and Barnabas? They have a dispute over it, right? They're not so sure whether they should take whom with them. John Mark, he had left in the first trip, not so sure we're going to take him on this trip. At least Paul's not so sure about that. So they decide to split up. Barnabas and John Mark go one way, Paul takes Silas, and they begin travels in a different direction. Who also then do we learn about here in chapter 16 that gets added to this mix? This is Timothy. Timothy's an interesting person because his background is what? It's both Jewish and Greek. He's got a Jewish mother and a Greek father. And was that known or unknown to most people? It's known, in that region known. Good reputation, bad reputation in the area? Good, okay? But the text says he had a good rapport, was favorable among the different people located there. And so you can appreciate this scene now. We've got these younger guys involved in some ways. Paul's traveling here. And we studied down to about verse 6 in relationship to our study. Paul wanted to head in what direction, and the Holy Spirit stopped him from that. Okay, he wanted to go in to Asia. And so let me show you this map real quick here on the screen to give you an idea. And I know it's not real detailed, and I'm not going to ask you to point to Messiah or Galatia or Phrygia on the map. I'll try to kind of guide you to where those are. But I want you to appreciate the magnitude of what Paul was doing in his travels. What I want you to appreciate about this map is, and I didn't do this in a great scientific way. I didn't get a ruler out. But this is the scale, okay, that's on the map. And so for every distance that I'm showing you right there, that's 200 miles, okay? So roughly, and somebody may have better eyes than me, but roughly on this map then, you're talking approximately 1,000 miles across this map, okay? Roughly in that area. And so I just wanted to illustrate that to you because all 3 trips are kind of represented here, and then his final trip, where does he end up? Rome, right? And did he get to Rome on a leisure trip? No, he'll end up in Rome as a prisoner. And that's that red line that you see that kind of has him working around it and all the way eventually into Rome. But this is a large, large area. Paul was covering, even in these missionary journeys that happened, you see the first one in red, or first one in a color you can't hardly differentiate, in orangish. The purple one is the one we're on now, and the yellow line is the third trip that he makes. But he's covering a large area in terms of the mode of transportation that they had, which was what? Walking and a boat. Those were basically the 2 things that you had access to in these travels. So, what we've got going on now then, in relationship to Paul, is the beginnings of this traveling, and again, you're looking at the purple line that we're dealing with. They have it starting in Jerusalem because that's kind of where the discussion occurred, and they made their trip back up to Antioch. So they were down here in Jerusalem. My red dot's not real bright. But they were down here in Jerusalem, so they made their way up here to Antioch, decided to make the travels, and here they come. Here's Derbe, here's Lystra, here's Iconium. So here's that area of Lystra and Derbe that we were talking about. Their idea is, let's travel over into Asia over here. But God says no. So they go northward up into the region of Galatia and spend some time in Phrygia, which is just right in that region right there is Phrygia. And again, you're probably not being able to see that red dot anyway. So, from there where? And I'm doing the map today because they don't really do it. It's just going to bounce before we slow down here in a minute. So where from there? Back to the text. Okay. Phrygia, Galatia, not into Asia, so they go into Mysia, and they essayed to go into Bithynia, but what happens? No, we're not going there either. Okay, it's not time to head into that region either. So they've made their travels over towards the region of Mysia, over by the Aegean Sea. So they've traveled up and across, up into Troas area, up by towards the top of the Aegean Sea, and then they're going to make their way across here in a moment. Bithynia, by the way, is just north of Galatia. Bithynia is right up here at the very tippy top of our screen on this right-hand side. That's where they thought they might head up into. God says no. They end up over here. Here's Mysia, and they end up in Troas right there up by the Aegean Sea in relationship to these travels. So they're passing by Mysia. They come down to Troas. In verse 9, a vision appeared to Paul in the night, and there was a man of Macedonia standing, beseeching him and saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. So here we go again. We've not Asia. Don't go into Bithynia. He's on in Troas now, and he says, rather than all that, how about going over into Macedonia? Macedonia is that region just across the Aegean Sea, right up here. This is Macedonia, here towards the top center of our map, is where Macedonia is. And that is obviously where God wants him to go. As he receives this vision, and this one crying for help in this vision, and he sends for him, and eventually we're going to see them end up in the area of Macedonia. When he had seen the vision then, verse 10, straightway we sought to go forth into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. God has told them two negatives thus far, right? Don't go to Asia, don't go to Bithynia, and just use your human mind for a minute. What's going through your mind at this point? Where does he want me to go? I thought I'd head down into Asia. No, not going to do that. Thought I'd go up into Bithynia. No, not going to do that either. And in your mind, you're thinking, well, where does he want me? Where am I supposed to go? And the moment you think it, what happens? He gets a vision. Here comes this vision. He sees this man from Macedonia calling to him to come over there, and they conclude that this is what? Who's really talking to them? God's telling them. This is God's way of communicating to them that that's where we need to be. We need to head to Macedonia in order to see the work of the gospel occur there. Come and help us in Macedonia, is what they said. So they set forth to go and preach the gospel there. So they set sail, as we showed you on the map, from Troas, made a straight course to Samothrace, and the day following to Neapolis. And so Samothrace, again, we're just crossing this wee little area, a kind of land area around this Aegean Sea. So we've head from Troas up through into Samothrace, and then to Neapolis there, to the north side of this map. And up by there, by the way, you'll see Philippi. We generally know that name because we have a book written to that church. And so that would be a town that would jump out at us a little quicker. That's the region we're in relationship to the work that they're doing. Verse 12. From thence to Philippi, which is a city of Macedonia, the first of the district, a Roman colony, and we were in this city tarrying certain days. So when they get to Philippi, what do? They stay. We've been traveling. We get to actually stop, and we're going to spend some time in Philippi and deal with them. What's interesting, or what's specifically mentioned about this town? Okay, it's a Roman colony. It's what else? It's an important city. He refers to it in the American Standard Version as the first of the district. And I believe that is in terms of its influence and power. Now, this is an important place in the region, for lack of a better description. This is an area that is important to the region and important to the cause of Christ as well. And they begin to spend some time there in that region. On the Sabbath day, see Paul as the evangelist, if you will, to what nation or what nationality? That's not even right. The Gentiles. There, you understood what I was asking you. He's the preacher to the Gentiles, and yet we find him making connections with Jewish groups just about everywhere he goes as well. And so he's down by the river looking. He supposed there should be a place of prayer there. And we sat down, and we spoke unto the women that were come together. It's interesting that among the devout, he finds them among whom? The women. That's been true in a lot of ways. For whatever reason, and I guess I don't have a very good explanation for this, but in my generic experience, I would suppose that for every man who kind of stays devout when his wife does not, I could tell you 10 women who stay devout when their husband does not. I don't know why that is. I don't have an answer for it. I just know it to be relatively, in anecdotal sense, is true. That for some reason there seems to be a devotion among women sometimes where you don't always see in men. Whether that's always true or not is irrelevant. It seems to be true here. Those who are devoted here in this region are described as there were some women that had gathered together there. Certain woman then among them was whom? Lydia. We always use Lydia in our children's classes a lot. She's a great Bible example of one who comes to know Jesus. What do we know about her according to verse 14? Okay, she's a seller of purple, and from where? She's from Thyatira. Okay, what's that? That's right. She is not from the region she's in presently, but that's a first. Interesting. My screen changed and yours did not. But she's from Thyatira. Did it change back again? All right. What it is, I just went too fast. I need to give it time. She's from Thyatira. Thyatira, interestingly enough, is here in Asia. Okay? Where Paul had been what? Don't go to Thyatira, because the person from Asia I want you to talk to is actually over there in Macedonia. It's an interesting kind of dynamic to the moment, where here's this woman who's not really where she normally would be, or she's at least not in her home region, but she's the one that we get first introduced to in terms of conversations that occur in connection to the preaching of the gospel. And so, all right, come on, cooperate. There you go. So what kind of person was she? We know where she's from. What did she do? Let me stop there for a minute. What was her occupation? Seller of purple. Now, does that jump out at us as interesting in our culture? If I told you my job was a seller of purple, you would say, what? Is that a very lucrative job? Probably not in our day. But in that day, seller of purple was a lucrative job. Purple was a dye that was not readily available, generally only had by people of substance and wealth, royalty. why do you think over time that when you see royalty depicted, you see them in what color is one that's prominent? Purple is. And it's been that way historically because in those days in particular, only those of prestige and power and influence and money could even buy materials dyed in purple. So if the selling of an item is expensive, most likely she is a person of substance herself. If she's selling an expensive item, she's probably making a pretty good living from this purpose. Now that may be somewhat of an assumption on my part, but it seems to be the case. That's who she is in that sense. But what's most important about her description there in verse 14? One that worshiped God. She's one that worshiped God. Has she heard the gospel yet? No. Does she know anything about Jesus, at least in very specifics yet? No. Here's a person who's just simply stayed devoted, has continued to worship and honor God from the things that she had been educated about, obviously from her youth up. And here she is continuing to do that. Paul finds her, and the text says in verse 14, whose heart the Lord opened to give heed unto the things which were spoken by Paul. Can God still open hearts? Yeah. God can still open hearts. It's not, I don't say that in some kind of respecter of persons way. I'm just saying the message of God can still open people's hearts. And the thoughts and purposes that God shares with us throughout Scripture, it still has the same potency it always has. When you get the right connection at the right time, at the right moment, you think about that. You think about to give heed unto the things that Paul was going to speak. And what was the result? Okay, verse 15 says, and when she was baptized. So we know her heart was open to the message. And we know the result of that, verse 15, was when she was baptized and her household, she besought us, saying, if we have been judged faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. I see this passage, by the way, very similar to what we see with the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, right? Remember when Philip joins himself to the chariot of the eunuch, and the eunuch's reading from what? From Isaiah. And he's reading a section of Isaiah that is about what event? Yeah, that's right. It's Jesus' crucifixion. The text is talking about a lamb led to the slaughter, and he asks, who's he talking about? The prophet talking about himself or somebody else? The text tells us that Philip began at that passage and preached unto him Jesus. That's all we know. All we know is that he preached Jesus, and the very next thought is the eunuch says what? He sees water and says, what hindereth me from being baptized? So the conclusion is Philip preached Jesus, and that message, whatever it included what thought? That the eunuch needed to be baptized, right? There's no other, I don't know any other way to make a conclusion from that. All he says was, I preached Jesus, and the result was the eunuch was baptized. Same thing here. All we know is her heart was open to what Paul was going to speak. We don't know the details at this moment of exactly how or what Paul spoke. All we know is that she was open to it, and the result was what? Verse 15, baptism. So the only fair conclusion to make is that Paul at some point in that conversation talked about what? Baptism. I don't know any other reasonable way to look at that, right? Why would she do something had it not been instructed to her to do it? Why would she have responded in that way if Paul had not at some point in the conversation had a discussion about it? It's a reasonable conclusion to make. And not just her, but who else? Her whole house. Anybody, her whole house listens and responds to that gospel message. The book of Acts is filled with examples just like that. And we'll continue to see them as we move forward. Where the message is offered and the result comes. And as we move forward, I'll probably show you some charts relative to this, but I'm going to bring it up in your mindset right now. It's always been interesting to me that of all the things that God requires of us in the New Testament, of all the things He asks of us to fulfill, that you'll find that baptism in the book of Acts is mentioned more than any other action that He requires. It's almost as if God sees the future issues that are going to be surrounding it, and so He gives us volumes. There's lots and lots of information that we're going to encounter throughout it. Right, so it's necessary to preach that within the message. And that's what we see. Why do we preach that? Because it's what we see them fulfilling. It's what we see happening in those days. And we simply reiterate the very things that they were fulfilling at that time. Any other thoughts? So it came to pass, as we were going to the place of prayer, that a certain maid, having a spirit of divination, met us, who brought her masters much gain by soothsaying. Demonic beings exist in that day? Yes. We've had this discussion before in the past. They existed in that day. We don't try to write that off. We don't try to ignore it. Don't try to act as if it's not true. It was real. Absolutely real. Now, there's some Old Testament references that show a time period in which that will go away. We can talk about that some other time. But for now, just appreciate the fact that this is real. This is a real moment where this woman is. And here's something else that kind of jumped off the page at me when I thought about this woman. She's got this issue, but who's kind of pushing this? She has masters. She's got those who are doing what? Making money, okay? Vulnerable people have been exploited forever, haven't they? Isn't that interesting? Here I'm reading this Bible text, and I'm thinking, here we are, hundreds and hundreds of years later, and vulnerable. It's not ingrained. We're the image of God, so He didn't give it to us. But behaviorally, man chose a path at some point where many men have decided that it's perfectly acceptable to exploit the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of others. And here's the very case happening here in this person. Here's a woman who has no ability to control this spirit that's within her. And there are those who are willing to exploit that for their own personal gain. What they're trying to do, to have this woman trailing behind them, if you will. Right. Yeah, is she soothsaying concerning them? And if so, who knows the validity of this anymore? And so it's definitely going to be detrimental to this. And she's doing it in a way what? What's the term? She's crying out, okay? She's making a big scene. Okay, it's not the attention that the Apostle Paul and those with him desire in order to fulfill their purposes. Even though she's saying the right things, that's actually counterproductive to what they're trying to accomplish. And for a while, what'd they do? Verse 18. They trying just to kind of ignore it, because it says this she did for what? Many days. Okay, there was a period of time that was going by. Many days had been going by. But Paul finally just what? It wears him out. Okay? It just finally wears him out. He is sore troubled over it. And he turned and said to the Spirit, I charge thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out that very hour. Can you imagine? We have seen folks who couldn't walk. We've seen dead raised. We've seen a variety of miracles in the life of Jesus and even in the early works of the apostles. But there's something very interesting or peculiar about here's this woman who, for however long, has been under this pressure and control of this evil spirit, and in an instant, Paul is able to remove that challenge. But who's upset about it? Those who've been making money off of her. When her master saw that the hope of their gain was gone. And by the way, twice we've seen it. Master or masters, plural. Plural. There's all at least two, if we understand language, at least two, if not more, have been profiting off of her soothsaying and all the things that went around that. And when they saw that that was gone, they laid hands or laid hold on Paul and Silas, dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And so they're going to try to create some kind of criminal act out of what Paul and Silas had done for the woman. So they bring them before the magistrates, verse 20. And they say, "These men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city." What's the first thing they say? They qualify them who they are. These Jews. What's that going to spark in the mind of a Roman ruler? Okay, they're the trouble, enemy, and I don't have to be concerned about what I do to them, right? Okay, because I'm just thinking Jew. Now, is that going to be an issue later in history? Eventually, Paul will bring up the fact that he's not just a Jew, but he's a Roman citizen, and that eventually will come. But at this point, they're just here's some Jews, and they've come to town, and they're causing trouble. No truth to that, but that's the charge. Right. Well, and even what minimal truth that they offer isn't factual and really doesn't have any base. Right. Yeah, they're the only ones hurt by this. But he said, "They set forth customs which is not lawful for us to receive or to observe, being Romans." They're teaching things that aren't fitting for Roman citizens. They're discussing matters that just don't fit our way of life and our culture and our societal influences. And so their charges aren't very valid. But there's a problem. Verse 22, "The multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent their garments off of them and commanded to beat them with rods." Strange time, isn't it? Where all you got to have is somebody to come forth, trump up some odd charges against you, basically say, these guys just don't act and talk and think like us. And it stirs the multitude up to the point where they're crying out to the magistrate, and he rents their clothes off of them and says, do what? Beat them with rods. By nothing more than the words of these handful of men who come and complain that their livelihood's just been taken away. And multitudes rise up, and they instruct them to beat them with rods. And when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely. Now, stop for a minute. Again, don't go to Asia, don't go to Bithynia. Instead, go to Macedonia, where you're going to meet a woman from Asia, and you're going to teach her and her household. They're going to respond. Then you're going to continue to teach, though, and you're going to encounter on your way general population, all those tiers that are all up and down, and where your general population of your prisoners. Then you go on the other side of the prison, and you go into that area where the worst of the worst were held, where they get, they're in there for 23 hours a day. They get an hour out of their cell all the time. What I'm trying to get you to vision is I understand it, is that inner prison, deep within the prison, the most secure you can have in the prison, that's where I want them, the magistrate. I want these guys secured. I don't want any potential for problems. I want them in the innermost part of the prison and keep them there securely. Cast them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. Yeah. What were the stocks, by the way? Yeah, and basically to trap you in place, and comfortably so. No, you ever been to Williamsburg? Okay, if you go to Williamsburg and just outside of the courthouse in Williamsburg, Virginia, just outside the courthouse, there are examples of Revolutionary time stocks. I lasted about 5 seconds. Is about all I could take. I can't imagine. I just want you to get. Because what's going to happen next is why I want you to get this imagery. I've been beaten with rods, okay? And I was beaten in such a way that the description, let's back up for a second. the description was, commanded them to beat them with rods, and when they had laid many, okay, who were the 40 stripes save one guys? That's the Jews, right? The Romans don't have such rules. The Jews had the 40 stripes save one, just in case they miscounted along the way. And so they would back off. They'd stop at 39 just in case the guy counting made a mistake, because they never wanted to go over. Not the Romans. Romans would just simply beat you until their pleasure was over, until they were decided they would be done. When Jesus was scourged, okay, who did that? That was the Romans. Okay, so don't. It's bad enough to think of it 40 times or 40 stripes save one. Not with the Romans. The Romans would simply, until they were satisfied that they'd done enough. And so the text simply says, many stripes have been laid upon them. They're cast into the prison. The jailer's been charged, you keep these guys safe and secure. So he throws them in the innermost part of the prison, puts them in the stocks, having encountered all of these things along the way, and made their feet fast, hard fast, in the stocks. Now verse 25. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns unto God. And who's listening? Prisoners. Don't go to Asia. Don't go to Bithynia. Go to Macedonia. And the end result is I end up in prison. And yet, even in prison, I have a what? An audience. The message of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as God intends it for it to spread, can happen in ways that you never expect. We just need to quit underestimating what God can do. He can put us in some of the strangest, oddest locations and circumstances. We might find ourselves in places that we never would have thought, and in that moment is a moment that God creates an opportunity for us. And then I appreciate the magnitude of here's these men singing and praying in the midst of those challenges. Lord willing, we'll come